Welcome to Redhead Rewriting Reality by Kimberly Sue Iverson, the story of my life as I figure out who I am after a lifetime of abuse and share my journey with that. Sharing my journey of building my author career, the struggles, bettering self, and creating a new life. I'm a multi-genre author who's published more than 53 stories and coming to you from the Pacific Northwest. And this podcast is for you because, like me, you love stories, journeys, and you just want to relax for a bit. So let me take care of you. This audio is intended for an adult audience. Themes and topics may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Now, get yourself comfy and make yourself at home. And let's dive in. This week, we're reading Tarzan of the Apes, chapter 13 and 14. And last week, when I was uploading everything, I kept having to go over all of the episodes, thinking I had missed chapters, but then thinking I had only missed one chapter. I don't know if it was because I was tired or I just couldn't make my brain see the chronological numbers. Either way, last week, I did also have issues with uploading because I think it was just Spotify that caused me problems. But the page for uploading and the page for the episodes kept having issues. So I was already, my brain was already messy in the first place. But hopefully I have not missed episodes. If by chance I do end up missing a chapter or otherwise for these kind of reads, then just let me know. Sometimes I do try to get a bunch ahead of time done so that I could get them uploaded and saved and buy me a week or two before I have to rush to get another episode up. And it's very easy if I'm doing multiple at once to overlook something, just trying to keep track of everything. Last week, Tarzan had learned the hard way that being a king of the apes in the most literal sense of his group was no longer something that was of interest to him soon after he ended up taking over, because he figured out that the responsibilities were a lot different when you had to deal with them personally. And he had realized that he had grown up to the point that he no longer fit in with the apes. So he handed it off to his council people to choose someone else to rule, and he walked off because he wanted to find his own kind. So this week we are reading, as I said, chapters 13 and 14 of Tarzan of the Apes by Edgar Rice Burroughs, read by your lovely host, Kimberly Sue Iverson. Chapter 13, His Own Kind. The following morning, Tarzan, lame and sore from the wounds of his battle with Turquoise, set out toward the west and the sea coast. He traveled very slowly, sleeping in the jungle at night, and reaching his cabin late the following morning. For several days he moved about but little, only enough to gather what fruits and nuts he required to satisfy the demands of hunger. In 10 days he was quite sound again, except for a terrible half-healed scar, which, starting above his left eye, ran across the top of his head, ending at the right ear. It was the mark left by Turquoise when he had torn the scalp away. During his convalescence, Tarzan tried to fashion a mantle from the skin of the boar, which had lain all this time in the cabin. But he found the hide had dried as stiff as a board, and as he knew naught of tanning, he was forced to abandon his cherished plan. Then he determined to filch what few garments he could from one of the black men of Mbanga's village, for Tarzan of the Apes had decided to mark his evolution from the lower orders in every possible manner, and nothing seemed to him a more distinguishing badge of manhood than ornaments and clothing. To this end, therefore, he collected the various arm and leg ornaments he had taken from the black warriors who had succumbed to his swift and silent noose, and donned them all after the way he had seen them worn. About his neck hung the golden chain, from which depended the diamond-encrusted locket of his mother, the Lady Alice. At his back was a quiver of arrows slung from a leathern shoulder belt, another piece of loot from some vanquished black. About his waist was a belt of tiny strips of rawhide, fashioned by himself as a support for the home-made scabbard in which hung his father's hunting knife. The long bow, which had been Kulanga's, hung over his left shoulder. The young Lord Greystoke was indeed a strange and warlike figure, his mass of black hair falling to his shoulders behind and cut with his hunting knife to a rude bang upon his forehead, that it might not fall before his eyes. His straight and perfect figure, muscled as the best of the ancient Roman gladiators, must have been muscled, and yet with the soft and sinuous curves of a Greek god, told at a glance the wondrous combination of enormous strength with suppleness and speed. A personification was Tarzan of the Apes, of the primitive man, the hunter, the warrior. With the noble poise of his handsome head upon those broad shoulders, and the fire of life and intelligence in those fine, clear eyes, he might readily have typified some demigod of a wild and warlike bygone people of his ancient forest. But of these things Tarzan did not think. He was worried because he had not clothing to indicate to all the jungle folks that he was a man and not an ape, and grave doubt often entered his mind as to whether he might not yet become an ape. Was not hair commencing to grow upon his face? All the apes had hair upon theirs, but the black men were entirely hairless, with very few exceptions. True, he had seen pictures in his books of men with great masses of hair upon lip and cheek and chin, but nevertheless Tarzan was afraid. Almost daily he whetted his keen knife and scraped and whittled at his young beard to eradicate this degrading emblem of apehood. And so he learned to shave, rudely and painfully, it is true, but nevertheless effectively. When he felt quite strong again, after his bloody battle with Turquoise, Tarzan set off one morning towards Mbanga's village. He was moving carelessly along a winding jungle trail instead of making his progress through the trees, when suddenly he came face to face with a black warrior. The look of surprise on the savage face was almost comical, and before Tarzan could unsling his bow, the fellow had turned and fled down the path, crying out in alarm, as though to others before him. Tarzan took to the trees in pursuit, and in a few moments came in view of the men desperately striving to escape. There were 3 of them, and they were racing madly in single file through the dense undergrowth. Tarzan easily distanced them, nor did they see his silent passage above their heads, nor note the crouching figure squatted upon a low branch ahead of them, beneath which the trail led them. Tarzan let the first 2 pass beneath him, but as the third came swiftly on, the quiet noose dropped about the black throat. A quick jerk drew it taut. There was an agonized scream from the victim, and his fellows turned to see his struggling body rise as by magic slowly into the dense foliage of the trees above. With frightened shrieks, they wheeled once more and plunged on in their efforts to escape. Tarzan dispatched his prisoner quickly and silently, removed the weapons and ornaments, and oh, the greatest joy of all, a handsome deerskin breechcloth, which he quickly transferred to his own person. Now indeed was he dressed as a man should be. None there was who could now doubt his high origin. How he should have liked to have returned to the tribe, to parade before their envious gaze this wondrous finery. Taking the body across his shoulder, he moved more slowly through the trees toward the little palisaded village, for he again needed arrows. As he approached quite close to the enclosure, he saw an excited group surrounding the 2 fugitives, who, trembling with fright and exhaustion, were scarce able to recount the uncanny details of their adventure. Mirando, they said, who had been ahead of them a short distance, had suddenly come screaming toward them, crying that a terrible white and naked warrior was pursuing him. The 3 of them had hurried toward the village as rapidly as their legs would carry them. Again, Mirando's shrill cry of mortal terror had caused them to look back, and there they had seen the most horrible sight: their companion's body flying upwards into the trees, his arms and legs beating the air, and his tongue protruding from his open mouth. No other sound did he utter, nor was there any creature in sight about him. The villagers were worked up into a state of fear bordering on panic. But wise old Mbonga affected to feel considerable skepticism regarding the tale, and attributed the whole fabrication to their fright in the face of some real danger. "You tell us this great story," he said, "because you do not dare to speak the truth. You do not dare admit that when the lion sprang upon Mirando, you ran and left him. You are cowards." Scarcely had Mbonga ceased speaking when a great crashing of branches in the trees above them caused the blacks to look up in renewed terror. The sight that met their eyes made even wise old Mubonga shudder, for there, turning and twisting in the air, came the dead body of Mirando, to sprawl with a sickening reverberation upon the ground at their feet. Again Tarzan came down into the village and renewed his supply of arrows and ate of the offering of food which the blacks had made to appease his wrath. Before he left, he carried the body of Mirando to the gate of the village and propped it up against the palisade in such a way that the dead face seemed to be peering around the edge of the gatepost down the path which led to the jungle. Then Tarzan returned, hunting, always hunting, to the cabin by the beach. It took a dozen attempts on the part of the thoroughly frightened blacks to re-enter their village, past the horrible grinning face of their dead fellow, and when they found the food and arrows gone, they knew what they had only too well feared, that Mirando had seen the evil spirit of the jungle. That now seemed to them the logical explanation. Only those who saw this terrible god of the jungle died, for was it not true that none left alive in the village had ever seen him? Therefore, those who had died at his hands must have seen him and paid the penalty with their lives. As long as they supplied him with arrows and food, he would not harm them unless they looked upon him. So it was ordered by Mubonga that in addition to the food offering, there should also be laid out an offering of arrows for this Munan go Kiwati, and this was done from then on. If you ever chance to pass that far-off African village, you will still see before a tiny thatched hut, built just without the village, a little iron pot in which is a quantity of food, and beside it a quiver of well-daubed arrows. When Tarzan came in sight of the beach where stood his cabin, a strange and unusual spectacle met his vision. On the placid waters of the landlocked harbor floated a great ship, and on the beach a small boat was drawn up. But, most wonderful of all, a number of white men, like himself, were moving about between the beach and his cabin. Tarzan saw that in many ways they were like the men of his picture books. He crept closer through the trees until he was quite close above them. There were 10 men, swarthy, suntanned, villainous-looking fellows. Now they had congregated by the boat and were talking in loud, angry tones, with much gesticulating and shaking of fists. Presently one of them, a little, mean-faced, black-bearded fellow, with a countenance which reminded Tarzan of Pamba the rat, laid his hand upon the shoulder of a giant who stood next him, and with whom all the others had been arguing and quarreling. The little man pointed inland, so that the giant was forced to turn away from the others to look in the direction indicated. As he turned, the little mean-faced man drew a revolver from his belt and shot the giant in the back. The big fellow threw his hands above his head. His knees bent beneath him, and without a sound he tumbled forward upon the beach, dead. The report of the weapon, the first that Tarzan had ever heard, filled him with wonderment, but even this unaccustomed sound could not startle his healthy nerves into even a semblance of panic. The conduct of the white strangers it was that caused him the greatest perturbation. He puckered his brows into a frown of deep thought. It was well, thought he, that he had not given way to his first impulse to rush forward and greet these white men as brothers. They were evidently no different from the black men, no more civilized than the apes, no less cruel than Sabor. For a moment the others stood looking at the little, mean-faced man and the giant lying dead upon the beach. Then one of them laughed and slapped the little man upon the back. There was much more talk and gesticulating, but less quarreling. Presently they launched the boat, and all jumped into it and rowed away toward the great ship, where Tarzan could see other figures moving about upon the deck. When they had clambered aboard, Tarzan dropped to earth behind a great tree and crept to his cabin, keeping it always between himself and the ship. Slipping in at the door, he found that everything had been ransacked. His books and pencils strewed the floor. His weapons and shields and other little store of treasures were littered about. As he saw what had been done, a great wave of anger surged through him, and the new-made scar upon his forehead stood suddenly out, a bar of inflamed crimson against his tawny hide. Quickly he ran to the cupboard and searched in the far recess of the lower shelf. Ah! He breathed a sigh of relief as he drew out the little tin box, and opening it, found his greatest treasures undisturbed. The photograph of the smiling, strong-faced young man and the little black puzzle book were safe. What was that? His quick ear had caught a faint but unfamiliar sound. Running to the window, Tarzan looked toward the harbor, and there he saw that a boat was being lowered from the great ship beside the one already in the water. Soon he saw many people clambering over the sides of the larger vessel and dropping into the boats. They were coming back in full force. For a moment longer Tarzan watched, while a number of boxes and bundles were lowered into the waiting boats. Then, as they shoved off from the ship's side, the ape man snatched up a piece of paper and with a pencil printed on it for a few moments until it bore several long lines of strong, well-made, almost letter-perfect characters. This notice he stuck upon the door with a small sharp splinter of wood. Then gathering up his precious tin box, his arrows, and as many bows and spears as he could carry, he hastened through the door and disappeared into the forest. When the two boats were breached upon the silvery sand, it was a strange assortment of humanity that clambered ashore. Some 20 souls in all there were, 15 of them rough and villainous appearing seamen. The others of the party were of different stamp. One was an elderly man with white hair and large-rimmed spectacles. His slightly stooped shoulders were draped in an ill-fitting though immaculate frock coat, and a shiny silk hat added to the incongruity of his garb in an African jungle. The second member of the party to land was a tall young man in white ducks, while directly behind came another elderly man with a very high forehead and a fussy, excitable manner. After these came a huge negress, clothed like Solomon as to colors. Her great eyes rolled in evident terror, first toward the jungle, and then toward the cursing band of sailors who were removing the bales and boxes from the boats. The last member of the party to disembark was a girl of about 19, and it was the young man who stood at the boat's prow to lift her high and dry upon land. She gave him a brave and pretty smile of thanks, but no words passed between them. In silence the party advanced toward the cabin. It was evident that whatever their intentions, all had been decided upon before they left the ship, and so they came to the door, the sailors carrying the boxes and bales, followed by the 5 who were of so different a class. The men put down their burdens, and then one caught sight of the notice which Tarzan had posted. "Ho, mates!" he cried. "What's here? This sign was not posted an hour ago, or I'll eat the cook." The others gathered about, craning their necks over the shoulders of those before them, but as few of them could read at all, and then only after the most laborious fashion. One finally turned to the little old man of the top hat and frock coat. "Hi, Professor," he called. "Step forward and read the bloomin' notice." Thus addressed, the old man came slowly to where the sailors stood, followed by the other members of his party. Adjusting his spectacles, he looked forward for a moment at the placard, and then, turning away, strolled off muttering to himself, "Most remarkable! Most remarkable!" "Hi, old fossil," cried the man who had first called on him for assistance. "Did ye think we wanted of you to read the bloomin' notice to yourself? Come back here and read it out loud, you old barnacle." The old man stopped, and turning back said, "Oh yes, my dear sir, 1,000 pardons. It was quite thoughtless of me. Yes, very thoughtless. Most remarkable, most remarkable." Again he faced the notice and read it through, and doubtless would have turned off again to ruminate upon it, had not the sailor grasped him roughly by the collar and howled into his ear, "Read it out loud, you blithering old idiot." "Ah, yes, indeed, replied the professor softly. And adjusting his spectacles once more, he read aloud, "This is the house of Tarzan, the killer of beasts and many black men. Do not harm the things which are Tarzan's. Tarzan watches. Tarzan of the Apes." "Who the devil is Tarzan?" cried the sailor who had before spoken. "He evidently speaks English," said the young man. "But what does Tarzan of the Apes mean?" cried the girl. "I do not know, Miss Porter," replied the young man, "unless we have discovered a runaway simian from the London Zoo who has brought back a European education to his jungle home. What do you make of it, Professor Porter?" he asked, turning to the old man. Professor Archimedes Q. Porter adjusted his spectacles. "Ah, yes, indeed. Most remarkable, said the professor. but I can add nothing further to what I have already remarked in elucidation of this truly momentous occurrence." And the professor turned slowly in the direction of the jungle. "But Papa," cried the girl, "you haven't said anything about it yet." "Tut, tut, child, tut, tut," responded Professor Porter in a kindly and indulgent tone. "Do not trouble your pretty head with such weighty and abstruse problems." And again he wandered slowly off in still another direction, his eyes bent upon the ground at his feet, his hands clasped behind him beneath the flowing tails of his coat. "I reckon the daffy old bounder don't know no more'n we do about it," growled the rat-faced sailor. "Keep a civil tongue in your head," cried the young man, his face paling in anger at the insulting tone of the sailor. "You've murdered our officers and robbed us. We are absolutely in your power. But you'll treat Professor Porter and Miss Porter with respect, or I'll break that vile neck of yours with my bare hands, guns or no guns." And the young fellow stepped so close to the rat-faced sailor that the latter, though he bore 2 revolvers and a villainous-looking knife in his belt, slunk back abashed. "You damned coward," cried the young man. "You'd never dare shoot a man until his back was turned. You don't dare shoot me even then." And he deliberately turned his back full upon the sailor and walked nonchalantly away, as if to put him to the test. The sailor's hand crept slyly to the butt of one of his revolvers. His wicked eyes glared vengefully at the retreating form of the young Englishman. The gaze of his fellows was upon him, but still he hesitated. At heart he was even a greater coward than Mr. William Cecil Clayton had imagined. 2 keen eyes had watched every move of the party from the foliage of a nearby tree. Tarzan had seen the surprise caused by his notice, and while he could understand nothing of the spoken language of these strange people, their gestures and facial expressions told him much. The act of the little rat-faced sailor in killing one of his comrades had aroused a strong dislike in Tarzan, and now that he saw him quarreling with the fine-looking young man, his animosity was still further stirred. Tarzan had never seen the effects of a firearm before, though his books had taught him something of them. But when he saw the rat-faced one fingering the butt of his revolver, he thought of the scene he had witnessed so short a time before, and naturally expected to see the young man murdered, as had been the huge sailor earlier in the day. So Tarzan fitted a poisoned arrow to his bow and drew a bead upon the rat-faced sailor, but the foliage was so thick that he soon saw the arrow would be deflected by the leaves or some small branch, and instead he launched a heavy spear from his lofty perch. Clayton had taken but a dozen steps. The rat-faced sailor had half drawn his revolver. The other sailors stood there watching the scene intently. Professor Porter had already disappeared into the jungle, whither he was being followed by the fussy Samuel T. Philander, his secretary and assistant. Esmeralda, the negress, was busy sorting her mistress's baggage from the pile of bales and boxes beside the cabin, and Miss Porter had turned away to follow Clayton, when something caused her to turn again toward the sailor, and then three things happened almost simultaneously. The sailor jerked out his weapon and leveled it at Clayton's back. Miss Porter screamed a warning, and a long, metal-shod spear shot like a bolt from above and passed entirely through the right shoulder of the rat-faced man. The revolver exploded harmlessly in the air, and the seaman crumpled up with a scream of pain and terror. Clayton turned and rushed back toward the scene. The sailors stood in a frightened group with drawn weapons, peering into the jungle. The wounded man writhed and shrieked upon the ground. Clayton, unseen by Enid, picked up the fallen revolver and slipped it inside his shirt. Then he joined the sailors in gazing mystified into the jungle. "Who could it have been?" whispered Jane Porter, and the young man turned to see her standing wide-eyed and wondering, close behind him. "I dare say Tarzan of the Apes is watching us all right," he answered in a dubious tone. "I wonder now who that spear was intended for. If for Snipes, then our ape friend is a friend indeed. By Jove, where are your father and Mr. Philander? There's someone or something in that jungle, and it's armed. Whatever it is. Ho, Professor! Mr. Philander!" young Clayton shouted. There was no response. "What's to be done, Miss Porter?" continued the young man, his face clouded by a frown of worry and indecision. "I can't leave you here alone with these cutthroats, and you certainly can't venture into the jungle with me. Yet someone must go in search of your father. He is more than apt to wandering off aimlessly, regardless of danger or direction. And Mr. Philander is only a trifle less impractical than he. You will pardon my bluntness, but our lives are all in jeopardy here. And when we get your father back, something must be done to impress upon him the dangers to which he exposes you, as well as himself, by his absent-mindedness." "I quite agree with you," replied the girl, "and I am not offended at all. Dear old Papa would sacrifice his life for me, without an instant's hesitation, provided one could keep his mind on so frivolous a matter for an entire instant. There is only one way to keep him in safety, and that is to chain him to a tree. The poor dear is so impractical." "I have it!" suddenly exclaimed Clayton. "You can use a revolver, can't you?" "Yes. Why?" "I have one. With it you and Esmeralda will be comparatively safe in this cabin while I am searching for your father and Mr. Philander. Come, call the woman and I will hurry on. They can't have gone far." Jane did as he suggested, and when he saw the door close safely behind them, Clayton turned toward the jungle. Some of the sailors were drawing the spear from their wounded comrade, and as Clayton approached, he asked if he could borrow a revolver from one of them while he searched the jungle for the professor. The rat-faced one, finding he was not dead, had regained his composure, and with a volley of oaths directed at Clayton, refused in the name of his fellows to allow the young man any firearms. This man, Snipes, had assumed the role of chief since he had killed their former leader, and so little time had elapsed that none of his companions had as yet questioned his authority. Clayton's only response was a shrug of the shoulders, but as he left them, he picked up the spear which had transfixed Snipes, and thus primitively armed, the son of the then Lord Greystoke strode into the dense jungle. Every few moments he called aloud the names of the wanderers. The watchers in the cabin by the beach heard the sound of his voice growing ever fainter and fainter, until at last it was swallowed up by the myriad noises of the primeval wood. When Professor Archimedes Q. Porter and his assistant, Samuel T. Philander, after much insistence on the part of the latter, had finally turned their steps toward camp, they were as completely lost in the wild and tangled labyrinth of the matted jungle as two human beings well could be, though they did not know it. It was by the merest caprice of fortune that they headed toward the west coast of Africa, instead of toward Zanzibar on the opposite side of the dark continent. When in a short time they reached the beach, only to find no camp in sight, Philander was positive that they were north of their proper destination, while, as a matter of fact, they were about 200 yards south of it. It never occurred to either of these impractical theorists to call aloud on the chance of attracting their friends' attention. Instead, with all the assurance that deductive reasoning from a wrong premise induces in one, Mr. Samuel T. Philander grasped Professor Archimedes Q. Porter firmly by the arm and hurried the weakly protesting old gentleman off in the direction of Cape Town, 1,500 miles to the south. When Jane and Esmeralda found themselves safely behind the cabin door, the negress's first thought was to barricade the portal from the inside. With this idea in mind, she turned to search for some means of putting it into execution. But her first view of the interior of the cabin brought a shriek of terror to her lips, and like a frightened child, the huge woman ran to bury her face on her mistress's shoulder. Jane, turning at the cry, saw the cause of it lying prone upon the floor before them, the whitened skeleton of a man. A further glance revealed a second skeleton upon the bed. "What horrible place are we in?" murmured the awestruck girl, but there was no panic in her fright. At last, disengaging herself from the frantic clutch of the still shrieking Esmeralda, Jane crossed the room to look into the little cradle, knowing what she should see there even before the tiny skeleton disclosed itself in all its pitiful and pathetic frailty. What an awful tragedy these poor, mute bones proclaimed. The girl shuddered at the thought of the eventualities which might lie before herself and her friends in this ill-fated cabin, the haunt of mysterious, perhaps hostile beings. Quickly, with an impatient stamp of her little foot, she endeavored to shake off the gloomy forebodings, and turning to Esmeralda, bade her cease her wailing. "Stop, Esmeralda! Stop it this minute!" she cried. "You are only making it worse." She ended lamely, a little quiver in her own voice as she thought of the 3 men upon whom she depended for protection, wandering in the depth of that awful forest. Soon the girl found that the door was equipped with a heavy wooden bar upon the inside, and after several efforts, the combined strength of the 2 enabled them to slip it into place, the first time in 20 years. Then they sat down upon a bench with their arms about one another and waited. Chapter 14. At the Mercy of the Jungle. After Clayton had plunged into the jungle, the sailors, mutineers of the Arrow, fell into a discussion of their next step. But on one point all were agreed, that they should hasten to put off to the anchored Arrow, where they could at least be safe from the spears of their unseen foe. And so, while Jane Porter and Esmeralda were barricading themselves within the cabin, the cowardly crew of cutthroats were pulling rapidly for their ship in the 2 boats that had brought them ashore. So much had Tarzan seen that day that his head was in a whirl of wonder. But the most wonderful sight of all to him was the face of the beautiful white girl. Here at last was one of his own kind, of that he was positive. And the young man and the 2 old men, they too were much as he had pictured his own people to be. But doubtless they were as ferocious and cruel as other men he had seen. The fact that they alone of all the party were unarmed might account for the fact that they had killed no one. They might be very different if provided with weapons. Tarzan had seen the young man pick up the fallen revolver of the wounded Snipes and hide it away in his breast, and he had also seen him slip it cautiously to the girl as she entered the cabin door. He did not understand anything of the motives behind all that he had seen, but somehow intuitively he liked the young man and the 2 old men, and for the girl he had a strange longing which he scarcely understood. As for the big black woman, she was evidently connected in some way to the girl, and so he liked her also. For the sailors, and especially Snipes, he had developed a great hatred. He knew by their threatening gestures and by the expression upon their evil faces that they were enemies of the others of the party, and so he decided to watch closely. Tarzan wondered why the men had gone into the jungle, nor did it ever occur to him that one could become lost in that maze of undergrowth, which to him was as simple as is the main street of your own hometown to you. When he saw the sailors row away toward the ship, and knew that the girl and her companion were safe in his cabin, Tarzan decided to follow the young man into the jungle and learn what his errand might be. He swung off rapidly in the direction taken by Clayton, and in a short time heard faintly in the distance the now only occasional calls of the Englishman to his friends. Presently Tarzan came up with the white man, who, almost fagged, was leaning against a tree, wiping the perspiration from his forehead. The ape man, hiding safe behind a screen of foliage, sat watching this new specimen of his own race intently. At intervals, Clayton called aloud, and finally it came to Tarzan that he was searching for the old man. Tarzan was on the point of going off to look for them himself when he caught the yellow glint of a sleek hide moving cautiously through the jungle toward Clayton. It was Sheeta, the leopard. Now Tarzan heard the soft bending of grasses, and wondered why the young white man was not warned. Could it be he had failed to note the loud warning? Never before had Tarzan known Sheeta to be so clumsy. No, the white man did not hear. Sheeta was crouching for the spring, and then shrill and horrible there arose from the stillness of the jungle the awful cry of the challenging ape, and Sheeta turned crashing into the underbrush. Clayton came to his feet with a start. His blood ran cold. Never in all his life had so fearful a sound smote upon his ears. He was no coward, but if ever man felt the icy fingers of fear upon his heart, William Cecil Clayton, eldest son of Lord Greystoke of England, did that day in the fastness of the African jungle. The noise of some great body crashing through the underbrush so close beside him, and the sound of that blood-curdling shriek from above, tested Clayton's courage to the limit. But he could not know that it was to that very voice he owed his life, nor that the creature who hurled it forth was his own cousin, the real Lord Greystoke. The afternoon was drawing to a close, and Clayton, disheartened and discouraged, was in a terrible quandary as to the proper course to pursue. Whether to keep on in search of Professor Porter at the almost certain risk of his own death in the jungle by night, or to return to the cabin where he might at least serve to protect Jane from the perils which confronted her on all sides. He did not wish to return to camp without her father. Still more he shrank from the thought of leaving her alone and unprotected in the hands of the mutineers of the Arrow, or to the 100 unknown dangers of the jungle. Possibly, too, he thought the professor and Philander might have returned to camp. Yes, that was more than likely. At least he would return and see before he continued what seemed to be a most fruitless quest. And so he started stumbling back through the thick and matted underbrush in the direction that he thought the cabin lay. To Tarzan's surprise, the young man was heading further into the jungle, in the general direction of Mubanga's village, and the shrewd young ape-man was convinced that he was lost. To Tarzan this was scarcely incomprehensible. His judgment told him that no man would venture toward the village of the cruel blacks, armed only with a spear, which from the awkward way in which he carried it, was evidently an unaccustomed weapon to this white man. Nor was he following the trail of the old men. That they had crossed and left long since, though it had been fresh and plain before Tarzan's eyes. Tarzan was perplexed. The fierce jungle would make easy prey of this unprotected stranger in a very short time if he were not guided quickly to the beach. Yes, there was Numa the lion, even now, stalking the white man a dozen paces to the right. Clayton heard the great body paralleling his course, and now there rose upon the evening air the beast's thunderous roar. The man stopped with upraised spear and faced the brush from which issued the awful sound. The shadows were deepening, darkness was settling in. God, to die here alone, beneath the fangs of wild beasts, to be torn and rended, to feel the hot breath of the brute on his face, as the great paw crushed down upon his breast. For a moment all was still. Clayton stood rigid, with raised spear. Presently a faint rustling of the bush apprised him of the stealthy creeping of the thing behind. It was gathering for the spring. At last he saw it, not 20 feet away, the long, lithe, muscular body and tawny head of a huge, black-maned lion. The beast was upon its belly, moving forward very slowly. As its eyes met Clayton's, it stopped, and deliberately, cautiously gathered its hind quarters behind it. In agony the man watched, fearful to launch his spear, powerless to fly. He heard a noise in the tree above him. Some new danger, he thought, but he dared not take his eyes from the yellow-green orbs before him. There was a sharp twang as of a broken banjo string, and at the same instant an arrow appeared in the yellow hide of the crouching lion. With a roar of pain and anger, the beast sprang, but somehow Clayton stumbled to one side, and as he turned again to face the infuriated king of beasts, he was appalled at the sight which confronted him. Almost simultaneously with the lion's turning to renew the attack, a half-naked giant dropped from the tree above, squarely on the brute's back. With lightning speed, an arm that was banded layers of iron muscle encircled the huge neck, and the great beast was raised from the ground, roaring and pawing the air, raised as easily as Clayton would have lifted a pet dog. The scene he witnessed there in the twilight depths of the African jungle was burned forever into the Englishman's brain. The man before him was the embodiment of physical perfection and giant strength, yet it was not upon these he depended in his battle with the great cat. For mighty as were his muscles, they were as nothing by comparison with Numa's. To his agility, to his brain, and to his long, keen knife he owed his supremacy. His right arm encircled the lion's neck, while the left hand plunged the knife time and again into the unprotected side behind the left shoulder. The infuriated beast pulled up and backwards until he stood upon his hind legs, struggled impotently in this unnatural position. Had the battle been of a few seconds' longer duration, the outcome might have been different, but it was all accomplished so quickly that the lion had scarce time to recover from the confusion of its surprise ere it sank lifeless to the ground. Then the strange figure which had vanquished it stood erect upon the carcass, and throwing back the wild and handsome head, gave out the fearsome cry which a few moments earlier had so startled Clayton. Before him he saw the figure of a young man, naked except for a loincloth and a few barbaric ornaments about arms and legs. On the breast a priceless diamond locket, gleaming against a smooth brown skin. The hunting knife had been returned to its homely sheath, and the man was gathering up his bow and quiver from where he had tossed them when he leaped to attack the lion. Clayton spoke to the stranger in English, thanking him for his brave rescue and complimenting him on the wondrous strength and dexterity he had displayed. But the only answer was a steady stare and a faint shrug of the mighty shoulders, which might betoken either disparagement of the service rendered or ignorance of Clayton's language. When the bow and quiver had been slung to his back, the wild man, for such Clayton now thought him, once more drew his knife and deftly carved a dozen large strips of meat from the lion's carcass. Then, squatting upon his haunches, he proceeded to eat, first motioning Clayton to join him. The strong white teeth sank into the raw and dripping flesh in apparent relish of the meal, but Clayton could not bring himself to share the uncooked meat with his strange host. Instead he watched him, and presently there dawned upon him the conviction that this was Tarzan of the Apes, whose notice he had seen posted upon the cabin door that morning. If so, he must speak English. Again, Clayton attempted speech with the ape man, but the replies, now vocal, were in a strange tongue, which resembled the chattering of monkeys, mingled with the growling of some wild beast. No, this could not be Tarzan of the Apes, for it was very evident that he was an utter stranger to English. When Tarzan had completed his repast, he rose and, pointing a very different direction from that which Clayton had been pursuing, started off through the jungle toward the point he had indicated. Clayton, bewildered and confused, hesitated to follow him, for he thought he was but being led more deeply into the mazes of the forest. But the ape man, seeing him disinclined to follow, returned and, grasping him by the coat, dragged him along until he was convinced that Clayton understood what was required of him. Then he left him to follow voluntarily. The Englishman, finally concluding that he was a prisoner, saw no alternative open but to accompany his captor, and thus they traveled slowly through the jungle, while the sable mantle of the impenetrable forest night fell upon them, and the stealthy footfalls of padded paws mingled with the breaking of twigs and the wild calls of the savage life that Clayton felt closing in upon him. Suddenly Clayton heard the faint report of a firearm, a single shot, and then silence. In the cabin by the beach, two thoroughly terrified women clung to each other as they crouched upon the low bench in the gathering darkness. The negress sobbed hysterically, bemoaning the evil day that had witnessed her departure from her dear Maryland, while the white girl, dry-eyed and outwardly calm, was torn by inward fears and forebodings. She feared not more for herself than for the three men whom she knew to be wandering in the abysmal depths of the savage jungle, from which she now heard issuing the almost incessant shrieks and roars, barkings and growlings of its terrifying and fearsome denizens as they sought their prey. And now there came the sound of a heavy body brushing against the side of the cabin. She could hear the great padded paws upon the ground outside. For an instant all was silence. Even the bedlam of the forest died to a faint murmur. Then she distinctly heard the beast outside, sniffing at the door, not 2 feet from where she crouched. Instinctively, the girl shuddered and shrank closer to the black woman. "Hush!" she whispered. "Hush, Esmeralda!" For the woman's sobs and groans seemed to have attracted the thing that stalked there just beyond the thin wall. A gentle scratching sound was heard on the door. The brute tried to force an entrance, but presently this ceased, and again she heard the great pads creeping stealthily around the cabin. Again they stopped, beneath the window on which the terrified eyes of the girl now glued themselves. "God!" she murmured, for now, silhouetted against the moonlit sky beyond, she saw framed in the tiny square of the latticed window the head of a huge lioness. The gleaming eyes were fixed upon her in intent ferocity. "Look, Esmeralda!" she whispered. "For God's sake, what shall we do? Look! Quick! The window!" Esmeralda, cowering still closer to her mistress, took one frightened glance toward the little square of moonlight just as the lioness emitted a low, savage snarl. The sight that met the poor woman's eyes was too much for the already overstrung nerves. "Oh, Gabrielle!" she shrieked, and slid to the floor, an inert and senseless mass. For what seemed an eternity, the great brute stood, with its forepaws upon the sill, glaring into the little room. Presently it tried the strength of the lattice with its great talons. The girl had almost ceased to breathe, when to her relief the head disappeared, and she heard the brute's footsteps leaving the window. But now they came to the door again, and once more the scratching commenced, this time with increasing force, until the great beast was tearing at the massive panels in a perfect frenzy of eagerness to seize its defenseless victims. Could Jane have known the immense strength of that door, built piece by piece, she would have felt less fear of the lioness reaching her by this avenue. Little did John Clayton imagine when he fashioned that crude but mighty portal that one day, 20 years later, it would shield a fair American girl, then unborn, from the teeth and talons of a man-eater. For fully 20 minutes the brute alternately sniffed and tore at the door, occasionally giving voice to a wild, savage cry of baffled rage. At length, however, she gave up the attempt, and Jane heard her returning toward the window, beneath which she paused for an instant, and then launched her great weight against the time-worn lattice. The girl heard the wooden rods groan beneath the impact, but they held, and the huge body dropped back to the ground below. Again and again the lioness repeated these tactics, until finally the horrified prisoner within saw a portion of the lattice give way, and in an instant one great paw and the head of the animal were thrust within the room. Slowly the powerful neck and shoulders spread the bars apart, and the lithe body protruded farther and farther into the room. As in a trance, the girl rose, her hand upon her breast, wide eyes staring horror-stricken into the snarling face of the beast scarce 10 feet from her. At her feet lay the prostrate form of the negress. If she could but arouse her, their combined efforts might possibly avail to beat back the fierce and bloodthirsty intruder. Jane stooped to grasp the black woman by the shoulder. Roughly, she shook her. "Esmeralda! Esmeralda!" she cried. "Help me, or we are lost!" Esmeralda opened her eyes. The first object they encountered was the dripping fangs of the hungry lioness. With a horrified scream, the poor woman rose to her hands and knees, and in this position scurried across the room, shrieking, "Oh, Gabrielle! Oh, Gabrielle!" at the top of her lungs. Esmeralda weighed some 280 pounds, and her extreme haste, added to her extreme corpulency, produced a most amazing result when Esmeralda elected to travel on all fours. For a moment the lioness remained quiet, with intense gaze directed upon the flitting Esmeralda, whose goal appeared to be the cupboard, into which she attempted to propel her huge bulk. But as the shelves were but 9 or 10 inches apart, she only succeeded in getting her head in, whereupon with a final screech, which paled the jungle noises into insignificance, she fainted once again. With the subsidence of Esmeralda, the lioness renewed her efforts to wriggle her huge bulk through the weakening lattice. The girl, standing pale and rigid against the farther wall, sought with ever-increasing terror for some loophole of escape. Suddenly her hand, tight pressed against her bosom, felt the hard outline of the revolver that Clayton had left with her earlier in the day. Quickly she snatched it from its hiding place, and leveling it full at the lioness's face, pulled the trigger. There was a flash of flame, the roar of the discharge, and an answering roar of pain and anger from the beast. Jane Porter saw the great form disappear from the window, and then she too fainted, the revolver falling at her side. But Sabor was not killed. The bullet had but inflicted a painful wound in one of the great shoulders. It was the surprise at the blinding flash and the deafening roar that had caused her hasty but temporary retreat. In another instant, she was back at the lattice, and with renewed fury was clawing at the aperture, but with lessened effect, since the wounded member was almost useless. She saw her prey, the 2 women lying senseless upon the floor. There was no longer any resistance to be overcome. Her meat lay before her, and Sabor had only to worm her way through the lattice to claim it. Slowly she forced her great bulk, inch by inch, through the opening. Now her head was through, now one great forearm and shoulder. Carefully she drew up the wounded member to insinuate it gently beyond the tight-pressing bars. A moment more and both shoulders through. The long, sinuous body and the narrow hips would glide quickly after. It was on this sight that Jane Porter again opened her eyes. End of chapter 13 and 14 of Tarzan of the Apes by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Read by your host, Kimberly Sue Iverson. More to come. Would you like to make a difference? A gift of 5, 10, 15, or more would make a huge impact on my ability to keep this podcast going for you and upgrade my equipment. With your gift, we can grow this together because I want to make this the best I can for you. And frankly, you would help so much with far more than that. You'd be helping me change my life. Give today at ko-fi.com/Kimberly Sue Iverson. That's ko-fi.com/Kimberly Sue Iverson. Your presence here matters so much to me, so thank you for being here. I am beyond grateful you chose to spend this time with me. What are your thoughts? Share with me and start a conversation. Just don't be rude about it. Remember, kings and queens, everyone is fighting battles inside nobody can see. Who are you willing to see today? And who are you willing to let see you today? I hope someone can bring a smile to you today, or you can bring a smile to someone else. If you would like the chance for your story to be read, whether it's something you wrote, a story passed down in your family, or have a suggestion on a story to read, get in touch. Stories to read at KimberlySueIverson.com. That's stories to read at KimberlySueIverson.com. If you'd like to follow my socials, I would love to have you. Don't ever hesitate to comment and say hi either. Find me under at Kimberly Sue Iverson for most sites: Instagram, Threads, Facebook, Blue Sky, and TikTok. There's also a Facebook page for Redhead Rewriting Reality. X is the only site I use Kimber Bites on. I also have a newsletter for my work. That's bit.ly/letters from Kimberly. bit.ly/letters from Kimberly. I always try to use the same profile picture and name no matter where I am, but you can always find my links on my link cave. That's KimberlySueIverson.com/link cave. That's LINKCAVE. What follows are bloopers or mistakes that I made during the recording of this podcast. He might readily have typified some demigod of a wild and warlike... Why am I not able to say the sentence? No, saying the sentence. And adjusting his spectacle...